Welcome back. Let's also talk about the Global South. What is now attained through the G20 presidency is an inclusion of the Global South into the priority setting of this grouping. Through the Voice of the Global South virtual summit in January 2023, India consulted as many as 125 countries that are normally left out of the process. Besides, countries from the Global South also dominate the list of guests that India has invited for this New Delhi summit, thus bringing the priorities of the Global South and becoming their main articulator is a major achievement of India's presidency. But what is the Global South? The Global South refers to countries often characterized as developing, less developed or underdeveloped, primarily located in Africa, Asia and Latin America. Today, in the bilateral meet with the US President Joe Biden, the Prime Minister is likely to push to Washington to strengthen its support for the Global South. Let me also, for the benefit of our viewers, break down on the world map what exactly is the Global South. Well, as the name suggests, this is of course the continents that are southern and are often divided because the north is more developed, certainly North America versus Latin America. You've got, of course, the Europe continent, especially Western Europe. It includes, of course, countries like, some of the countries like Ukraine and others. And then, of course, this green zone, minus Japan, minus Asia, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, the other developed countries. This green zone including India, China, you've got Middle East, Africa, Latin America. This is what is referred to as the Global South. Basically countries that are still developing and need more strength. And why is this Global South important? The Global South is important for many reasons. First of all, remember that these are countries which have large populations, as much as 85% of the global numbers. These are countries with rich cultures, history and a lot of natural resources. They also have a growing economic heft. They contribute more than half to the world's economic growth today. And by 2030, 3 of the world's largest economies will come from the Global South. These include, of course, India, China and Indonesia. Now, the intra-South trade is also accounting for over a quarter of global trade, which is also why this grouping is very important. The GDP in terms of purchasing power of the Global South BRICS nations has surpassed that of the Global North's G7 club. Now there are more billionaires in Beijing than in New York City. Now this bloc is also asserting itself politically on the global scene, and therefore a lot of these countries are coming together, with India really championing their cause for a global seat as far as these big events are concerned. So the PM in his recent interview to moneycontrol.com also highlighted the need for the Global South to be heard more. This is what he said. He said India's growth advances the interests of Global South. So of course, the fact that India does well helps this bloc as well. G20 Troika can amplify the voice of the Global South, which is why a lot of the invitees from India are countries from the Global South. Global South concerns raised at multilateral forums. We are the voice for inclusion of those who felt excluded. There are a lot of issues as far as the Global South are concerned. They haven't really been on the table so far. They haven't been heard. They've been excluded from the world's growth, and this is why they need more support. The Prime Minister also added should seek views outside the G20, especially from Global South, and this is a cause that the Prime Minister has been championing for quite some time. I also spoke to ORF President Samir Saran about how India can be the champion of the Global South, but can it also be a leading voice or a leader for the Global South? Here's more from that conversation. Let me talk to you about the Global South. We're hearing this term a lot more than we did in recent past. Why is the Global South so important? And again, can India be the leading voice of the Global South as it is seemingly positioning itself?
India can certainly be one of the important, loud and rational voices of the South that seeks architecture, a global governance architecture, a global political architecture that allows these countries to benefit from globalization like others have done in the past, to ensure that globalization remains available to these countries as others seem to be shutting the door, and to help shape policies that will benefit the specific needs of these geographies that don't necessarily seem to have been catered to by either the Western European or the American systems. So I think India should not position itself as a leader of the South. India should be a leading voice for the South. India should be a voice of innovation for the South, of building new development partnerships for the South, of changing the multilateral financial architecture that caters to the South. We must be the architect for a new South. Now, why is South so important for us today? It's precisely because the world seems to be reverting back to its, if I could use the word in a global context, its own tribal identity, the Western continental identity, regional identity. You know, the world seems to be retreating to that old format. So going back to the future in a sense, right? So India in this moment has to continue to ensure that in a 21st century context, can we continue to be the leaders of the third way, where we don't have to make choices, where we are able to do business with both, where we serve our people first, and we are not being fodder to the political cycles that these two different groupings are going to want us to be. So we don't want to be a feedstock for them and their politics. We want to make sure that we are able to feed, grow, and meet the aspirations of our people, and that has to be the reason why Global South is important.
Daniel and Madhav continue to be with us. So, Madhav, let me begin with you. Not possibly the leader of the Global South, but certainly a leading voice for the Global South. And that's a role that already under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we seem to be playing. Would you agree?
Well, I agree with that, and I'd only like to say that in my view, China is certainly not a member of the Global South. China, from the point of view of its total economy and even its geographic position, is not really a member of the Global South. India very definitely is part of that. And that's the first point. And the second point is, Shivani, that the good news is that, we just now saw Joe Biden coming, and he is probably, reached the Prime Minister's house. Would you believe it? In the 1990s, for the 8 years of Bill Clinton, China was given every access it wanted to sophisticated technology by the United States and by United States partners. And guess which country was denied about 90% of that technology? And its own technology was thought to be smothered. You guessed it. It's the world's biggest democracy, India. That is the crazy illogic of geopolitics in the era of Cold War 1.0. And now things have changed. Now it is very clear to both sides. In India also, we have a lot of romanticists who have got some romantic views about, everybody can be together. I mean, all of us can be friends. Yes, all of us can be friends. The two sides want to be friends. But if the other side is looking only to harm you,
okay,
well, it's going to be difficult for you to be a friend. So from that point of view, the big news, the big takeaway is Xi Jinping has stayed away because he's not interested in a discussion on the boundary issue. And frankly, the Prime Minister of China functions under the president. He has no authority to act on his own, and his entire portfolio is economic. So China would like to keep the focus on economics. But the reality is economics is also there. It rides on geopolitics and geopolitical fault lines. And that is something that this G20 is demonstrating. I'd like to again say that the fact that Xi Jinping has missed this summit, he is basically trying to insult the entire Global South, because this summit is about the Global South.
Okay. Speaking of the Global South, let me bring in Daniel as well. Daniel, there is, of course, you can argue whether China is part of this bloc. There is an ambiguity of whether Russia is part of this bloc or is part of the Global North. I'll leave that aside. But is the Western world or the Global North beginning to accept and acknowledge that the Global South needs to be given a bigger chair at the table?
I think to some extent, at the very least, the United States is appreciating that a lot of the competition in today's globalized world is happening in places that we describe as the Global South. And that competition is partially just between the United States and China. but it's in other ways as well. And so, from the U.S. perspective, there's if not an appreciation that all of the demands of the global South need to be met, I think a greater appreciation of the heft that they bring in terms of new and emerging markets, opportunities for investment and trade, and so on. And that China, whether or not it's a part of the global South any longer, has made remarkable inroads in that part of the world and has, in various ways, provided a kind of leadership that the United States now sees as problematic. And India also sees that as problematic because it has its own aspirations for competition with China and its own aspirations for global leadership in the global South and beyond. And so there you see a convergence, I think, of to a degree of US and Indian interests of providing alternatives to the
Right.
global South, alternative models of development, alternative economic partners, alternative partners for the provision of technologies, including in financial technologies, where China, again, has made considerable inroads and has the potential, if it continues to basically win that competition in ways that would block out the active participation of other states. And that's something that certainly worries Washington. So, yeah, I don't think we've come to the point where we fully appreciate the global South and its demands, and
Okay.
there are problems with that. But we see it as a critically important place and partner for this competition with China.
Absolutely. Well, this is also a reminder of how the countries that have the best interests for all of the world need to come together to also be a bloc against the forces that are expansionist in nature and don't have the best interests of everybody at heart. I do thank Madhav and Daniel for joining us. Many thanks for your time. But as we talk about the Global South or we talk about the G20 summit, one of the big shadows on this summit is, of course, the absence of not just Russian President Vladimir Putin, but specifically the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's not attending this summit. Will it have an impact on the stature of the G20 summit that New Delhi is hosting? Once again, listen in to what President of ORF, one of the biggest think tanks in the country, Mr. Samir Saran, has to say. Speaking on the subject of China, both President Putin and President Xi Jinping are not coming, and Mr. Putin hasn't been traveling much, so I'll keep that aside. Will the absence of Xi Jinping in any way bring down the stature of this G20 summit and its conclusions?
Xi Jinping has also not been traveling. As you may have noticed, he's not gone to the ASEAN meeting as well. So he has skipped that meeting as well. He has troubles at home. Xi Jinping is a curious case. He always wants to be the big man in a room.
In the room, yeah.
At the G20, he's a small man in a very big room. It doesn't suit his style. He would rather go to a club of smaller countries where he would lord over them. He has the emperor syndrome. And he wants to always have a court with him as he travels.
Yeah.
Now, G20, no one is going to give him that kind of a treatment. And Xi Jinping, and certainly India is not going to give him that kind of a treatment, and which is good. So, I think Xi Jinping, between his emperor syndrome and the fact that his country is in doldrums today, even yesterday I was reading that there are likely to be far bigger bubbles that are going to be now witnessing a complete blowout in the coming few days, including some more real estate companies, some financial sector companies. We are seeing a meltdown in China. We are seeing youth unemployment. We now hear buzz, and it's very difficult to corroborate what really happens inside the Great Wall of China. But we are hearing that there is a disgruntled element within the party that is now they are beginning to raise their voice.
Yeah, so breathing down Xi Jinping's neck.
They're breathing down his neck. So Xi Jinping has trouble at home, and he's not necessarily the most appreciated man in the world today. I just started, that the world today is a ABC world, anybody but China world. That yes, they are playing with the small boys and they believe they have a great footprint in terms of number of countries, but in terms of global GDP, much of it is today suspicious of China, and that's a big difference compared to, say, 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. People believe post-pandemic China will come roaring back, But because Xi Jinping has destroyed the decision-making body within the Communist Party, which means the heterogeneity of views, the debate among elders, he has destroyed that format. Today there is one man thinking, and if he doesn't think too well, then the country is in trouble. And clearly Xi Jinping may not be the brightest man to lead China out of this mess that is of his own making. And I think he needs to spend time at home and look after his own affairs.
We also go back across to the national capital, the Delhi airport, where Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, his aircraft has landed, and he's also all set to get out of his aircraft. This is coming close on the heels, of course, of the US President Joe Biden landing just a short while ago. The US President is going to be holding a bilateral very soon. He's on his way to the Prime Minister's residence, 7 LKM. For that bilateral with the Indian Prime Minister. But we're waiting the arrival of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has also landed in New Delhi. Now, as far as India and Canada are concerned, of course, friendly countries, but recently there has been some issues that have cropped up because of the entire Khalistani element connected to the community there. And some of the moves or the noises that those Khalistani movement members have made in Canada, targeting either temples or other installations, and the response of the Canadian establishment towards them. So that has been a bit of a thorny issue as far as India and Canada are concerned. We'll wait and see if those issues are raised. But certainly, as far as some of those attacks that have taken place recently in Canada, in Australia and in UK, the Indian External Affairs Minister was very categorical in saying that these are because of domestic issues as well. They have, they do get the support of the politicians in these countries, and that is why these elements are allowed to run amok. So the Canadian Prime Minister's aircraft has landed in the national capital, and of course he's going to be escorted very quickly out of the airport as well. What is another feature as far as these arrivals are concerned is that there is this platform, as you can see, where you've got a troupe performing a classical Indian dance form, and that has been a feature that has been done as far as the entire G20 summit arrivals are concerned. All right, even as we await Justin Trudeau deplaning at the national capital, it's time for me to take your leave. My colleague Anand Narasimhan is joining you on the right stand on the other side.